Thanks. It's good to be here. So yes, I am the agency alliances lead at WP Engine in EMEA. So briefly about WP Engine, for those who don't know, it's the world leading platform for WordPress, powers about 5% of web traffic at the moment. And my primary role is to work with the leading independents and the big networked agencies across EMEA, helping them get the most and their customers to get the most out of WordPress as a digital platform.
Amazing. Cheers, James. Thanks for joining us today. Julio?
Kieran. So I am Julio. I'm Hallam's CEO. So my main focus at the agency is innovation and strategy, both our agency strategy, but also helping our teams develop digital strategies for our clients. My background is in user experience and brand in my previous roles as creative director. I have quite a lot of experience actually in web design, web development, and so on. So it's a topic that I'm really quite passionate about, other than the fact that you've kind of made me come to this webinar.
Definitely. No, great to have you, Julio. Charlotte, welcome. Would you like to give a little introduction to yourself?
Oh, yes. Hi, I'm Charlotte. I'm the media director here at Hallam. I'm responsible for the SEO, paid media and content marketing teams, ensuring that we're improving our service and innovating all the time to make sure we get the best results for clients. My background is mainly in SEO, but I have kind of worked across all the sort of different disciplines that we offer. And I've worked with a variety of clients from B2B to B2C and God knows how many industries. So yeah, quite a wide range of experience.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Charlotte. Great to have you here. Just for everyone who's watching at home, there's a chat function on Zoom. So if you look to the bottom of your screen where it says chat, I'll post a quick message in there now so you can see it. But any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to pop them in there and we will get to them all throughout as well. Amazing. So, let's kick this off. We wanted to talk firstly about the user. How have consumers changed during 2020? Obviously, no one could have predicted what this year would have looked like at the start. I know it's interrupted a lot of people's plans when it comes to marketing and their personal plans as well, which also has an effect on the user. It'd be great to get your guys' opinion on what that sort of user landscape looks like now. It's quite obvious that businesses will never go back to what they were before, and there's almost like a forced digital transformation which is happening. Julio, have you got any points on how users are becoming more digital savvy?
Yeah, I think there's a convergence of a few different factors. Obviously, the most obvious one is the pandemic and the way that lockdown and remote work has embedded new ways of working and new ways of shopping in everyone. It's not just how we work in our day jobs, but also how we shop for groceries, how we shop for things that previously we would have gone to the shops to do. I think some of it is temporary. I think some of it is a result of the lockdowns and the restrictions, but I think some of it's here to stay. I think some people have realized how much more convenient online shopping can be and how much more choice there can be by doing it. And I think some of those trends are here to stay. I think another part of this convergence that I mentioned is the population change. The timing of this pandemic, I think, has accelerated something that was already happening, which is this changing of the guard from boomers and Gen X towards millennials and younger. So 70% of the world's workforce is now millennial or younger. And that is going to leave a permanent, that combined with the sort of like forced transformation of the pandemic, I think it's going to leave a permanent mark on the way that we do business and the way that we shop. And for that reason, I believe that evolving the way that you think about experiences and becoming much more agile, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute, that's the most important lesson to learn from the pandemic before it's too late to react. So that's my main kind of viewpoint on it.
No, there's some interesting points around the convenience of shopping online as well, Julio. James, surely you guys have seen an upsurge in sort of website visitors across the board, and also when it comes to e-commerce and also B2B decision makers, using their time at home to visit websites as well. Is that the case that you're seeing it back at WP Engine?
Absolutely. There's a couple of points there. Taking that one specifically, we've seen a massive increase in traffic and inquiries and just general business for our platform. We've also seen that WordPress has been on a healthy trend as it is. When I joined 2 years ago, the company, it was around about 34% of the web. It now sits at sort of 38% of the web. So there's a lot more swell around that part of the market as more businesses are trying to get online quicker. Picking up on Julio's point, which is actually looking at the younger generations, we're finding that actually we're not looking at people transacting online for convenience, as that was potentially the case in the past. This is now a place in which people will do business on a regular basis. And when we talk about those younger generations, they actually hold 40% of all consuming buying power, and that's about $150 billion globally. But if you think about how much they influence, because a lot of these guys are younger and they don't actually have their own money to spend, they actually have an influence over $600 billion worth of revenue. And what we're seeing now is this need as a market to think about actually how do we serve this new customer that actually is more intelligent when it comes to interacting with digital. They're more demanding, but actually what's happened, because they're leading the way in which people are interacting on digital, they're bringing the other audiences with them in terms of all the other generations. So now as businesses, we're having to, we can reach a much broader audience than we ever have done through the digital channels, which means that now is the perfect time to be making sure that we do have the right digital strategy.
No, definitely, mate. And I've just fired a poll out then for the attendees to answer, and I think everyone's in agreement at the moment that their website journey at this point in time is very important for them. Charlotte, what are your opinions on, or your what you've learned over 2020 in terms of how consumers are changing or acting now that we weren't seeing last year?
Yeah, I guess just to kind of reiterate Julio and James's points, it's obviously been like a sort of complete breakdown between sort of the physical and the digital, and a lot of people who would have shopped in store. I think Google released some data on this actually. It said it was something like more than a third of UK shoppers who would have shopped in store on Black Friday are now going to be doing that online. So we've got to take into consideration what people are going to be expecting from that experience, and we've already seen various things that people have been doing, like developing virtual try-ons and all this kind of thing that we'll probably be talking about in a little while. But yeah, I think it's about the customer demand and what they're expecting from the experience. And I think another thing to bear in mind as well is that with the pandemic and kind of moving into recession, people are potentially going to be tightening their purse strings and potentially are going to be looking to brands that they trust over other brands. So that's going to be really, really important moving forward as well, is making sure that you're instilling that trust in the customers, because if they're going to be spending their hard-earned money, you want them to choose you. So that's also something to think about. Absolutely.
That's picking up on your point there, Charlotte, around trust. The reason I'm harking back to sort of the Gen Z study is actually that's something that we've done here at WP Engine. We commissioned some research on this specific generation and actually how they use and expect to interact with digital, and we compared that with the other generations. And we've done that for 3 iterations now. The first study was launched in 2016. And trust and authenticity for the younger generation comes up time and time again. So it's really key that as brands and as businesses, you think about how you build authenticity into your digital presence. One of the key factors is that now it's about bringing your own customers into your commentary, into your advertising, and not using just like brand endorsements. That doesn't necessarily work for the younger generation.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a massive sway, isn't there, in terms of you know, decision makers, consumers, you know, people who want to who are going to part with their cash or the business's cash to definitely align themselves with companies or brands who share the same values. And I think that's just more prevalent along the, you know, the younger demographic as well, James, as you said then. And you know, we know decision makers are getting younger online as well. You know, is that going to impact the way that we have to showcase our website? You know, the younger generations now, they you know, we were chatting about the fact of chatbots and sort of wanting that sort of presence to jump onto a website and not necessarily spend time looking through the website. You know, everyone's time is a little bit shorter now, and the attention spans are shorter. So, you know, how does chatbots and having that sort of one-to-one presence work, or will work for those younger Gen Z moving forward? How do you think that will work, James?
I think it's a really good point. Firstly, you know, there is this thing about, this is true to millennials as well. They want people to have an opinion, and they want people to sort of back a sort of a cause, and that's very much the case. And they're very forgiving. So even if it's not something they truly believe in, or it's not an experience they thought that they were going to enjoy, the fact that it was tried and experimented, and you can pivot and try something new, is something that this generation is open towards. But looking at WP Engine specifically, we have a chat function within our business, and it's powered by humans in our particular case. And we've got a big team of about 20 people globally that will interact from the get-go with our audiences, and it drives a huge proportion of our business, both from a revenue perspective, but also from a support model perspective. But I think, you know, from what I've read, what is key is that actually just be authentic and let people know whether they're dealing with a bot or a human, and take them on the correct user journey from there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, you know, obviously WP Engine deals with a lot of support issues, so that's vital as well. Julio, question to yourself around, you know, B2B businesses. What have bots got to play in the role of a B2B website?
I think B2B has always been built on relationships, right? So going to making an inquiry, having a face-to-face meeting somebody in the trade show. I think the relationship element of B2B is more important than it is in B2C, certainly online. And I think the chatbot is a really good way of evolving the one-to-one human contact. The chatbot chat functionality is a good way of evolving the human contact. But I think what chatbots can do is they can embody the personality of the brand and begin to make things conversational rather than this sort of read-only experience that we've had for years, where you just go to a website, you read the content, you fill a form in, wait for somebody to call you. I think chatbots can enable something that's more interactive, more two-dimensional. But I think it's a case of experimenting with lots of different things. It's not just chatbots. I think Charlotte and I this morning were talking about voice in terms of Alexa, Google. There's a lot of untapped potential in those things, even for B2B. And I think this pandemic has effectively advanced the digital maturity of consumers by 10 years in a matter of weeks. So I think we need to make the most of that maturity and that willingness to try new things by being brave and trying experiences that are maybe not that comfortable for B2B or B2C, because I think users are ready for new things. I think they are ready for something that isn't just an ad that they click on, or isn't just a landing page that they land on. I think we're looking for different experiences now, and the fact that you're sitting in your own home, I think changes the whole all the parameters that you expect from business are already different, right? So I think it's the right time to be brave with marketing.
I think you make a good point there, Julio, in terms of you've got to try and make it engaging. You've got to try and bring them in on this journey. And this really hard thing around personalization, no one's really cracked that at the moment, but I think that can be broken down into small chunks. You can have things such as you know, a chatbot functionality that can perhaps, you know, speed up that process to get the right content through to the individual sooner. Voice is another great medium to do that in. We know that actually that video is going to become a massive aspect of digital experiences. In fact, that you know, the younger audience think that most websites will be video based within the next 5 years. And I think that the staggering fact for me is that if we don't get this right, the impact is huge. So if you do not have a personalized experience, if you're a Gen Z, that you're 40% likely to leave that website. And that's the same for millennials and for Gen X. So you're talking about a huge percentage of the population, a third of that generation set will walk away as well if you're not creating that personalized experience. And for me, that starts with having a good user experience, right? And you guys, that's your bread and butter in terms of being able to help businesses understand that aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. It's an amazing point, isn't it? Because we're now having a conversation about websites, about how websites need to be adaptable for our consumers, and everything that we're saying is we need to put the user first. We need to put their journey first, their experience. Charlotte, in the past, it was very much focused on what does Google want? How is Google going to scrape our website, our business's website? How is that going to impact our rankings? So how important is that still? And should we just go after being user focused, or do we still need to find that balance between pleasing the Google bots that are going to scrape your website, but also pleasing the people who actually land on it as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, especially over the past kind of year, there's been sort of rapid change in that area, and I think we don't really need to make that distinction necessarily anymore, because everything that you're doing for users to make their experience good is also good for Google. Obviously, you still need to find a balance between kind of like more traditional SEO considerations, like making sure you've got a certain amount of content on the page and this kind of thing. But that content also needs to be useful to users, otherwise there's literally no point in it. Because Google will know, we know with their algorithm, they look at user signals, they look at how people are interacting with your content, they're looking to see if they pogo stick back to the search results from your content. So if you're not making that also useful for the user, then you're shooting yourself in the foot. So I'd say, yeah, we don't really need to kind of make too much of a distinction between what's good for SEO and what's good for UX anymore, because they're so closely interlinked. Especially with the Google algorithm update next year, where Google has specifically told us that they're going to be taking UX into consideration when they're ranking pages. So yeah, does that kind of answer your question? I think what you do that's good for UX is always going to be good for SEO as well.
I think it's a really good point, and I think for a while now we're seeing Google more or less neutralize all of the things that we used to obsess over all the time. And Charlotte makes a great point, saying we need to stop thinking about what's good for SEO, what's good for the user. It's the same thing, right? And what's also true is that what users want changes all the time, and that's why it's really important to design for people rather than for some like arbitrary or like objective measure of what we think people want. I think you need to listen to them. You need to do user testing. You need to do research. And you need to design for users. For example, and this is one of the most common arguments in design history probably, is how long should the page be? How many words should be on it, right? It's a very difficult thing to decide, because one school of thought will say you need 1,000 words on it, and then the designer and the user might say I want 15 words on it. But actually, there isn't one answer to that. And I think when we talk about agility, and that's what one, the central topic of today is about website agility, what it means is that you have to think on your feet, and you have to do it constantly. You have to constantly continue to evolve and experiment and try new things, and stop thinking of your website as a thing that you do once every 5 years. You launch it, you leave it alone, and then see what happens. It's something that needs to change in its role within marketing, and that it isn't just a repository for things, it's actually an experience. And that is an important point of distinction that I think is probably overdue for most marketeers.
I think it's an amazing point what you said about being a sort of depository there, Julio. And there's been previous roles I've worked in the past where you have people come along and go, "Oh, that's great, put it on the website," and there's not really much thought to it. It's just, oh, it's something we have, so we should put it on the website. But there's no real consideration there for the for the end user, the person who's going to be visiting your website. So I suppose it's, it's something as marketers that we have to continually ask ourselves is, are we doing this for the business, for ourselves, or are we doing it for the user?
A good example of that is a real world example of this exact problem is Morrison's, right? Morrison's, where I live, have started doing click and collect, and that's become a massive thing, but they have nowhere to actually do that. They have no bays, nothing designed to do it. So they've had to improvise and create this sort of like emergency DIY click and collect space in the car park as a result of the change in demands from the customers and what they want from you, right? So they could do one of two things. They could say, well, supermarket logic or supermarket SEO equivalent would say, we don't have click and collect bays because that's not the business model. Or you could say, there's been a global pandemic, people don't go to the shops anymore, we need to change, we need to iterate, we need to now turn the car park into a click and collect bay. That is agility in action, right? So if we're prepared to do that for a supermarket, why are we not doing it for our websites? Why are we not doing it for whatever it is that we're doing, right? And that's the constant fluid, think on your feet mentality that is needed now, because I think the business that we had in February before the pandemic really hit will never come back. And I think the business that we'll have next February will not be what we have today. So that speed of change is incredible, and that needs a different way of thinking, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think a lot of brands and businesses are kind of guilty of being very insular, and obviously need to put way more focus on what the user actually needs, but also more focus on looking at your competitors and what they're offering. If a lot of your competitors are really getting on with installing live chats, chatbots, all these things that the users want, if you're not doing that, you're just rapidly going to get left behind, especially with everything that's going on at the minute. So yeah, focusing on your users, but also remembering to take a look at your competitors as well.
Definitely. I think you're totally right. And there's so many quirky ideas coming out now from products that we use each and every day, which, getting back onto sort of like that sort of value conversation about wanting to engage with values. I've just been hit by an ad on YouTube before jumping on this webinar from a company called something along the lines of I Don't Give a Crap. And it's basically a company who provides toilet roll wrapped in paper, cardboard boxes, and there's no plastic involved, and 50% of their profits are going to recycling charities and things like that. So I think understanding your users, but then understanding competitors like that who are not a big name in the the toilet paper industry, but they're making an impact in their own sort of little significant way because they know there's a gap in the market there as well. And I'm definitely going to check the website out just from that one ad alone. Rachel popped in the comments then, that isn't agility another word for common sense? And yeah, I think you're right there, Rachel, it is. But I think there's a little bit more to it than just common sense, because a lot of people don't act on common sense. And I think what we need to start doing is really acting on being agile. James,
I think it's if I could just jump in one sec here, and I think it's a good point. Another word for common sense, in a way, yes, but I think it's also mindsets, right? It's the willingness to accept that everything needs to change all the time. That's what agility really is. So you have to be ready to pivot quickly. And the conversation around chatbots is a great example. I remember 5 or 6 years ago, there was the famous responsive design disaster of 2014, I think it was, where Google introduced an update that basically decimated any website that wasn't mobile first. And I remember repeatedly going to pitches with clients in B2B who said, who's going to buy my product on a mobile? Why would I do that? Right? And I think that's because we rely on tried and tested strategies and philosophies and mindsets that have worked for us. But the reason the word agility means that you not only that you're able to quickly change, is that you know that you have to do it, and therefore you're just constantly prepared for it. Because what was a gradual and inevitable change to mobile maybe 6 years ago, I think now we're going to see rapid transitions to different business models within months, within weeks. I think click and collect, curbside pickup is one good example of that. There are industries doing it that you never would have thought would ever do it, and they're doing it now. So yeah, so that's what I think it's a good point. But I think agility is a very difficult cultural shift at business level, not just in marketing, in my opinion.
No, it's an interesting point. You know, obviously we know the user demands are changing as they always will, but they're changing so quickly at the moment. You know, it's quite tricky to keep on top of it all. So I think being sector specific on that is a good approach. But when it comes to, you know, business decisions and making impactful change with your market and with your website, James, have you had any sort of things which have popped out over the last sort of 6 months in terms of how websites have almost redefined their business to adapt to those sort of changes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, coupling that with the agility piece, it's, for me, at a senior level, it's about making, you know, when you think about digital technologies, it's about making the right choices. Do you go down a path where you find yourself locked into long licensing agreement contracts where the resource pool of talent there is quite small and expensive, and there's a long wait in line to be able to change anything on your site because of the nature of those situations and those communities? Or do you as a business openly adopt open source technologies where there is, you know, lots of open API connections? It's more of that hub and spoke model approach to digital. And there are huge communities. If we just take WordPress, for example, there are 50,000 plugins for WordPress that's available for everyone to use. And there is a developer community of greater than 500,000 people. So there's no surprise then that we're seeing a shift in the market where even the biggest enterprises, we did a study with 300 enterprise businesses that had turnovers of greater than 3 billion. And they, as a trend, we're actually increasing the number of content management systems that they are using. And what we're finding is that they're adopting a lot of open source technologies like WordPress and Drupal, and to be their secondary solutions in order to get to market quickly with their content and to remain agile from a creative perspective as well.
Definitely. Yeah. You know, one of the things that I always think when it comes to agility, especially when it comes to your digital presence, is that you have to be quick with it. Like Julio said, you have to be fluid. And, you know, I think there's a fear for a lot of us because it's changing so quickly. You know, marketers might be thinking at the moment, well, you know, is it really worth putting my time and energy into making this change right now when it might change again in 2 months' time? You know, Charlotte, have you got any sort of advice or opinions on why it needs to have that constant change?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess just to talk about an example of how you could do that with a client that we have at Hallam. So when they're actually a catering supplies company, and obviously when lockdown happened, a huge amount of their business, which was restaurants and cafes and so on, essentially stopped overnight. And they realized very quickly and were able to kind of pivot and very quickly to starting to sell takeaway things. And then they've actually experienced a huge growth year on year in organic visibility and revenue, just because they were so quick to kind of jump on what they believed their customers were now going to be searching for and actually coming through to their site and buying. And there's various ways you can do that. You know, one example is using Google's Rising Trends tool that they have, and these are all free tools you can use from Google, and it will show you, okay, what are the fast rising retail categories in my space. So using a tool like that and being able to jump on these trends could actually lead to some really interesting growth. And you know, you said, oh, well, what's the point in doing it in case things change again? Well, in that very example, you know, lockdown was lifted and people started going to restaurants again, but you know, on the horizon, potentially lockdown is going to happen again. So now they've got all these categories there, they've got all that content there, they've got everything there to then benefit from the changing situation. So I'd say you just have to jump on it and go for it. Otherwise, you're not going to get the benefit.
I think. Sorry, Kieran. Go ahead.
I was literally just going to say it's an amazing point on how they can adapt a product range that they already have very easily to a market which they might not have been interested in the past. And we know during lockdown, takeaways went through the roof. So I think.
But I think the point Kieran, that's really important that Charlotte just made is the amount of times that we have seen a client where the website doesn't reflect what they actually do and who they actually are is very high, right? So it's changing the role of your website from being the outcome of everything you are to being at the very forefront of what represents you, right? So that let's say you are purpose driven, you're very strong about your values, you've pivoted through COVID and started prioritizing certain things like remote work or whatever. Those things are the ones that need to lead your current proposition, rather than something that was frozen in time 3 or 4 years ago that's no longer reflective of what's actually going on. So there are restaurants, for example, that are shut, that are doing click and collect or delivery or whatever. They haven't changed their menus. They haven't changed the way that they operate. They don't explain how to do certain things because the website is the last of their thoughts. And actually, when you consider that 90% of people are going to, probably more than 90% of people in the UK are going to the website before they do anything else with any business, you need to change that thought process about what role does it play in the user experience. It's right at the very start. It's no longer something that happens after they've bought a product or when they're coming to check you out.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry to interrupt you, by the way.
No, I think that's a great point. I was going to follow on from that. Is what we've seen is that a lot of our customers had used their web presence as something that was quite top of funnel in the B2B world anyway. So it was like, okay, if we can do a mass market of email and so forth, it's not very personalized, it's going to land to a very generic website. And then they'll pick up the phone, or then they'll come and meet us at an event, or then we'll go and have a face-to-face meeting. And then the sort of that medium to actually transact in a B2B world in a face-to-face environment was something that everyone knew. What we're finding now is that medium's no longer there, so much so. And I don't think that's ever going to come back in huge amounts in terms of being able to go to a face-to-face event, or certainly not going to be able to meet each other in the short term. So actually, people are going further down the digital funnel, if you like, in terms of buying something with a B2B business, further than perhaps businesses had planned for. And I think that comes back to your point in terms of, that coffee shop or wherever it may be. Are you adjusting your experience to be able to take people on that journey and further down that funnel?
Yeah, no, I mean, one interesting thing that you mentioned then, James, for me was about, having to now be, you mentioned about the events and those face-to-face meetings, and now they're online, something like this may have happened on a stage or something, 12 months ago, and now we're being, we're sort of at home and we're online. And one thing that I do actually, I'm using websites more of a reminder point of view. I'll get onto a call with someone now, a B2B style call, and the first thing I do before they log in is I'll pull the website up on another screen. That's something that, people haven't had chance to do in the past when you are in person with them, unless they've got their phone and they look sort of a little bit odd by, standing in front of you with your website on their phone as well. I actually had a call from a guy who, as part of the call, he started walking me through his website and everything, how we mentioned experiences, and we mentioned about making them more pleasant for the user and stuff like that. Are there any sort of things that people can, not necessarily quick wins, but things that people should be thinking about, or what can a marketer do if they have this website which is being set up maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, they haven't really had a look at it? Where do they start in actually figuring out, okay, is this actually beneficial for my user?
I mean, a good place to start would actually be engaging with the customers, and actually doing some surveys, do some sort of usability testing, to actually work out what a user actually needs from the website. Because until you do that, you kind of, I'd say, taking a bit of a stab in the dark. So, for example, I don't know, if you're a travel company, you know, your website is probably getting a lot less traffic and you're getting a lot less customers, but how can you actually try to get any customers that you can? Okay, well, maybe you need to sort of ask them, and perhaps it's putting front and center the fact that you do flexible bookings and that your cancellation policy is amazing, or whatever it is, and actually then reacting very quickly to that and making those changes to the user experience that are going to encourage people to book with you is one example. And so actually, like engaging with your customers and doing some surveys, I think would be a good place.
I think that's a good point, and I think another thing that's really important is purpose. So we have one of the major consumer trends at the moment is the awareness of privacy and the avoidance of advertising and this sort of increasing immunity to traditional marketing methods, the hard sell, you know, looking really impressive and hoping people buy from you. That is on the decline. So I think what consumers want is purpose and personality and an emotional connection to the brands that they buy from. So one great place to start is, are you actually human as a brand? Do you connect with the people that you're trying to sell to, or are you using fairly, you know, outdated or very safe or very faceless type of communication? And for example, is your imagery real? Are you using stock photos? Is your messaging written in a way that it really reflects the kind of company that you are, and what does it really mean to work with you? And I think that is a really good starting point, because people are looking for digital experiences sometimes as a replacement for things that they would have done face to face in the past. So your website has to work a lot harder than ever before. There's a really great question, if I can just jump into that, Kieran, from Rachel about do you think digital faceless purchases will change depending on the value of the purchase? So I presume what that question means is, higher end purchases, do they need face-to-face contact? Yes, I think they will. I think that face-to-face contact will likely change towards video and other things. But that's another great example of why messaging and purpose are so important, because what you get from face-to-face contact is a feeling, and it's actually really what it's about, right? It's like humans are hardwired to react to personalities and to react to facial expressions and those things. And I think written content, photography, video can do some of that work for you. But I think if you have a website that doesn't offer the same type of personality as you would in face-to-face, I think you're going to have a lot more work to do to earn a sale, especially when we know that younger buyers demand experiences, that demand personalization and purpose and all these different things. And we also know that most of your competitors, or some of your competitors, are definitely going to be investing in brand. So that I think is another side of it, like making sure that you're putting purpose and the mission of your company at the forefront of your proposition, not just your products.
I think in the short term, people still want to interact in a face-to-face feeling in order to do those higher transactions, because it's about that trust piece. But what we're seeing from a data perspective is that the younger audiences are actually building communities with individuals that they've never met before. You know, only do they have these relationships in a digital medium. And actually 25% of Gen Z trust their connections online more so than face to face. And so that's a changing trend. And I think we've got to think about how we actually build that trust and that experience into our platforms that we're designing in order to meet that shift.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the point that Charlotte was talking about before. Is I think some of the more traditional SEO practices would have forced businesses to speak in a very dry way. Their messaging would have been written for robots, written for search engines, and at the expense of the user. And I think it's changing that, but also balancing it with the realities of what it does take to rank or to be successful in digital marketing.
Absolutely. I think, you know, the question that Kieran posed to start this sort of section of the topic off was, you know, what are the quick wins that you can do? I think it depends on where you are in your digital journey. we assume that most people have a website, but does your website serve all aspects of your client journey? If it doesn't, how can you plug the gap that you've got? And my advice, based on what we're seeing with our customers, is go to market quicker rather than sort of holding on and trying to make it sort of the perfect vehicle for that particular use case, and iterate. Actually, what was surprising for me is that we're seeing a lot of sort of the younger startup businesses, particularly in the WooCommerce space, that's driven by influencer marketing. When we're actually engaging with those agencies, we're finding out that there's a reasonable chunk of money set aside in the annualized budgets for iterative design changes as you go, to, a retainer fee. And that's always been something that surprised me in the last few months.
Yeah. No, you notice it yourself as well, don't you? When you visit a website, and if you are even if you're a customer of that website already, if that website makes, changes quite regularly, you can feel it when you visit as well. And, as long as those changes on the website are informed by data in terms of, from a UX point of view, what do people actually want from the website as well. It's only going to benefit the business. There's constant small changes rather than the sort of huge project.
I think that's the key thing, Kieran. It's constant improvement. It's continuous improvement. It's no longer about rebuild the website every 3 years and that there's a massive step change in cost. There is loads of evidence that there's lots of data that proves that constant small investments and iterative improvements to the website will give you a much better return return on investment over the long term.
And ultimately will allow you to be more agile to those changing consumer demands as they sort of change.
Exactly.
And one of the questions come in before, and I think we touched on it slightly, but it'd be good to how I've sort of evaluated the question anyways. Given the shift in stands and different audiences from a UX point of view, how do you go about understanding the UX of your website if you have a very, two very different target audiences who both visit it? And I'll pop that question to Charlotte, since James and Julio just finished chatting.
So what was the question? So if you've got both B2B and B2C?
Not necessarily B2B and B2C, but two very different target audiences. So it could be a website with maybe two different product lines or two different brands where they want to amplify it through the same website. Maybe the correct approach is just split it and get two websites, but is there a way to fulfill two different types of audience on the same website?
Yeah, I think it happens a lot. I think there are two different meanings to that question. One of them is, how do you ensure that your UX is good, considering that your audience is changing all the time? How do you stay on top of it, right? I think that is actually what agility is about, right? It's constantly reacting and predicting and so on. On the question of like, how do you serve two different audiences? That is down to a very carefully balanced approach to design, where you understand if you need to segment your users or not, and if so, where and what those journeys need to be. So Apple, for example, do it. There's business and there's consumer products. There are education providers do it all the time in terms of international and non-international students. And there's lots of different ways that you can segment audiences for different purposes and tailor that messaging specifically. But then you can also get into more advanced personalization techniques where you're changing the experience and the content based on who's there at that time, based on what you know about them, and that's when it can get really quite complicated, but also very interesting in terms of the results. But I think the question that's been posed here is more, how do you stay on top of your experience if audiences are constantly shifting? There's these shifting sands that we talk about, right? How do you do that? And I would say sort of constant, continuous improvement and a commitment to change, constant change, rather than a tried and tested, you've designed it once and that's it, which is how we've done that traditionally, to be honest. And I think it needs to change, I think.
Definitely, yeah.
I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, feel free to ask again.
hope it did. It came from anonymous on that. So if an answer, give us a thumbs up. We had, I think a very, cool point about that sort of split, because as soon as you say it, I think everyone can recall a website they visited in the past where it says something along the lines of B2C or B2B or something like that. Premium or personal, and so yeah, and then they take you on a different journey as you click through. We've got a question in the comments here: do you have a ballpark feel for what proportion of overall marketing budget is being set aside for iterative changes? I mean, I'm happy to start on that one. I think it depends how big your budget is ultimately, rather than having a percentage of it. You need to make sure that you're working with people who can make the changes that you need and that your audience are looking for. In terms of budget splits, to have more of that retainer style, has anyone got any thoughts on that?
It's a difficult question to answer. I think the amount of change that we have to make, that we have to do right now, is higher than I think has ever been, because I would say almost every single business model is disrupted in one way or another. And I'm sure WP Engine, for example, who are already a distributed company with global presence, with largely a remote model for operating with customers, have had to make changes because of surge in demand in certain areas, perhaps more tickets being raised because of whatever issues are happening. That requires a different approach to marketing, a different approach to the way your website is designed. So I think it's very I would urge against using the current landscape as a benchmark for what anything should be in the future. But I would say that in the current time, we should prioritize the ability to change and the ability to be iterative with everything over anything that's too permanent. So if I were to give you like a feel, in my opinion, I would say like maybe 10-15% of your budget maybe should be set aside for iterative work. Maybe 20%, maybe right now with COVID being a little bit higher. If you think about like for every pound that you've got, every £5 you've got to spend, you spend one on iteration. I think that, to me, that feels like a good balance. But I don't know what you guys think, but it's a hard question to answer, Rachel.
It's very open-ended. Charlotte, you got any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think I broadly agree with what Julio said. I think it's obviously going to vary massively, but it would be good, you need to get a feel for how you're benchmarked against competitors and like how much potentially you need to improve. So yeah, iterative change is fine, but potentially you need to ramp that up. So, one example of a tool that you could use for any sort of like quick wins in terms of experience, you could use Google's Grow My Store tool. So if you've got an e-commerce site, and if you literally put your website in there, it will benchmark you against your particular industry in various factors, like whether you've got certain things on your site that a user expects. So if you were to do something like that, then you would understand, okay, well, we're not doing X, Y, and Z, therefore we need to put more budget into making these changes. So I'd say it's important to kind of try and benchmark where you are currently, rather than just apportioning a certain amount every month.
Yeah.
One example of that, we're currently working with a customer, an e-commerce customer, who are expanding into the US. And we're finding very quickly that there are adjustments that they need to make to their proposition, to the experience, to the checkout process for the US market, because it's so different from what we expected. And that calls for a very quick and urgent realignment of what we think is important to make sure that we can hit the targets and the goals that we were looking for. Now, that was unplanned. We didn't know that we'd have to do that. But that's where agility comes in. So you kind of go, okay, well, we were going to do a bunch of SEO. We're not going to do that anymore because actually we've got enough traffic, but the conversion rate's too low. So we're going to go do this other thing now. And that would very quickly change our strategy, because I think it's partially rooted in the fact that most of the research that we can use to prove whether something's going to work or isn't going to work, it's probably not that useful anymore, because it's rooted in an era that doesn't exist anymore, which is the pre-pandemic. It's almost like it's a black swan moment in the history of digital. Before lockdown and after lockdown. And I think everything that we use from pre-lockdown to validate the future is probably not going to work.
Yeah,
I think
my add-on to that is, set yourselves up for the ability to be able to react quickly and move budget in and out of certain pots where needed by, making sure you're getting contracts that are month to month and not 3 years. Making sure you're working in areas which is perhaps license free and open source, more so than actually, hey, we just had to lump £100,000 over to this particular vendor, and you can't get away from that. So be nimble with your vendors, with your choice of technologies, in order to be able to flex that budget.
that's a very good point, James. That's always been a very big reason to use WordPress. Is the ability for a brand to take its website and go to any developer or build an in-house team without being tied to anything proprietary or expensive. I think we finally conquered that battle that WordPress isn't for business, so that it isn't for B2B or whatever. I think that's over now, thankfully. That took a long time. But I think WordPress is a platform that can give brands agility, in the sense that you can very, very quickly change without having to rely on a big cumbersome legacy platform that you've invested hundreds of thousands in maintaining over years.
Definitely. Cool, guys. We're approaching the end now. So before we wrap up, I do invite the attendees at home to ask any further questions in the comment section. We've talked about, just to give a bit of a recap in terms of how user habits have changed during 2020, which means businesses have to change their approach to how they've been doing marketing to be more user focused, to make sure they are digitally agile. And we also touched on sort of the ins and outs of being able to adapt quickly. And I think, the overall census is don't be afraid to make changes now, and be quick with them, because you can always make further changes down the line as well when it's needed. What I really want to do is sort of get like a final takeaway from each of you before we close off the webinar, unless any more questions pop up. James, just about that, what we were saying in terms of, it's okay to get it wrong sometimes. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I love this little takeaway from Jeff Bezos in terms of 2 tenets of leadership and success that he's employed in his business. The first one is failure has to be part of growth. And the second one is actually, take time to actually be curious and experiment. And an example that he gave was that they took this approach, launched the Amazon Fire Phone, which actually was a huge disaster in terms of revenue. But out of that came ultimately Alexa, which now has hundreds of millions of devices globally, and is a huge tenet of their business going forward.
Yeah, such an amazing story, the Alexa, and I think it's a integral part of many people's homes nowadays as well, isn't it? Charlotte, how important is sort of being reactive? Have you got any sort of final takeaways on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing is you need to be reactive, but also don't forget about sort of the longer term plan. I mean, you think about what your customers need right now and what opportunities potentially that have arisen over the past 6 months and how you can capitalize on them. So I mentioned, rising search trends, any like experience improvements that you can make, and also making sure that you benchmark against your competitors as well, using free tools that are available. But also, think about what your customers are going to want in the future, and how your particular industry is changing. So a chatbot is going to be important in the future. Is virtual or augmented reality going to be important? So you need to sort of start planning for that right now to kind of stay ahead of the curve. So I think being reactive, also thinking about the long term.
Yeah, and I suppose a big part of that is what you mentioned then, Charlotte, is about adapting to the market as well. Julio, what are the worries if people don't adapt?
I think for me it's a really exciting time to be a marketeer, to be honest, because it's a time where you can really make an impact by adopting the future, by adapting to the future. And I think be quick. I think that's the answer to me. It's be quick and find experiments like these guys are saying, but then find trends, listen to your customers, and then move quickly. I would say, without a doubt, the customers that we have, clients we've got at Hallam who have really made the most out of COVID are the ones that moved first, and the ones that saw the situation and said, well, we can either wait for the shops to open and for everything to be normal again, or we can change our business and we can go and do this other thing. And those are the ones that have succeeded. And Charlotte spoke about this catering brands that we work with. That's exactly what they did. They looked at the early signs and they said, we're going to do this other thing now. We're going to sell online and we're going to do it this way. And most of their competitors have waited for the restaurants to reopen, and that's not going to happen. So I think desperate and unusual times call for bold bravery, and that's what we need to do now. And I think history will look back at this time from a marketing point of view, and as unimportant marketing is in the grand scheme of things, considering, you know, we've got the brightest people on earth looking for vaccines and such things, we still have a part to play. And I think looking back in a few years, we'll see that those who moved quickly and moved first were the ones who made a success out of the situation. And those who waited for the past to come back won't be there to take part in the discussion.
Fantastic. I appreciate that, Julio. James, absolutely pleasure to have you on today, mate. Thank you very much. For anyone who's watching, if you haven't had a chance to check out that Gen Z study yet, please do. Charlotte, always a pleasure. Super interested in terms of the tools that you mentioned for us to use then as well. And Julio, obviously, always love listening to what you got to say, mate. Appreciate you coming along today. But more importantly, thanks for everyone who attended. And if you're watching this on YouTube, thanks for sticking to the end. If you've got any questions about anything we talked about today, please feel free to drop me a line, get in touch, and continue the conversation there. So thanks very much, guys, and have a lovely evening. Bye now.
Thank you.
Here.